The NFC East is once again a beast in 2023. What's going on, BLV? It's Mitch here to give you my full preview, record predictions for all four NFC East teams: the Dallas Cowboys, the Philadelphia Eagles, your NFC champions, the New York G-Men, and the Washington Commanders, breaking down the depth charts, the rosters, the strengths, the weaknesses, my overall projection and prediction for each one of these NFC East beasts in this division that I believe is the most competitive top to bottom NFC division by a long shot. And I believe all four of these teams can make the playoffs this year if the cards fall in their favor. Let me know in the comments your NFC East predictions. Don't forget to Gronk Spike the like button and subscribe for more NFC, AFC, and NFL division previews just like this. I'm doing one of these videos for every single division in the NFL. Let's talk about the NFC East a little bit before we get to our first team. Last year, they sent two teams to the playoffs. Three teams to the playoffs. I almost forgot about the Giants. Three of the teams were in the divisional round. That's crazy. 3 out of the 4 best NFC teams were from the same division. Will that repeat? We'll see. The Giants were a surprise team. The Cowboys actually have the second most wins in the NFL over the past 2 seasons. The only team that has more wins in the regular season is the Kansas City Chiefs. And the Philadelphia Eagles, well, they made the Super Bowl and they were so close to winning it. And they were probably the most dominant team during the regular season last year. So high expectations for the NFC. Some changes in Washington that could make them very intriguing as well. All 4 of these teams are really interesting to me for different reasons. So let's begin with the NFC East champs from a year ago, the NFC champs from a year ago. The Philadelphia Eagles were nearly unstoppable last season. They only lost 1 game in the regular season with Jalen Hurts, their starting quarterback, playing. So that's pretty impressive. 1 game, and it was within this division to the Washington Commanders. That's crazy. The only other loss they had was in the Super Bowl to the Kansas City Chiefs. And if some things bounce their way, like the fumble, for example, or maybe, not my favorite pass interference call at the end of that game, or a punt return that nearly went for a touchdown, it really felt like the Eagles were the better team in that game, and they just didn't have things go their way. They could easily be Super Bowl champs for the second time. So the Philadelphia Eagles, man, loaded roster on offense and defense. I think many people believe this is one of the best rosters in the NFL. I believe it's a top 3 roster in the NFL this year. They have, in my opinion, the best offensive line in the NFL. They have an ascending superstar quarterback, ascending skill talent around that quarterback, and a lot of depth on the defensive line, and some veterans that know how to win and get it done. Nick Sirianni now has confirmed that he appears to be a pretty darn good football coach as well. So there's a lot of stability with this team, and they feel like one of the safest bets to be a good team once again in 2023. So let's take a look at the roster rankings for the 2023 season in terms of where I ranked the Eagles in numerous different categories. So it begins at the quarterback position. As you guys can see, there's only one category. I ranked them below the number 10. So this is a top 10 team across the board. And in 3 different categories, I had them at number 1, which is downright crazy. I think this might be the most impressive rankings collection that I have and that I have seen so far doing these previews. Quarterback 5 is Jalen Hurts. I have him just below Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, and Lamar Jackson. And he's my number 5 for me. Jalen Hurts, after one spectacular season, he pretty much just has to confirm to us this year that he can maintain that elite level, that he can maintain that MVP caliber play, that those guys ahead of him have continued throughout their careers, right? Can he get to that MVP trophy this year? I think, to me, he might be the favorite to win that award. If they can once again be the number one seed in the NFC and he can put up the numbers that he's been putting up, this guy can win the MVP. What I especially like about Jalen Hurts personally is not even his play. Like, I appreciate his powerful legs, his ability to create yards with his legs. I've always appreciated his danger in terms of scrambling and pure rushing ability, dating back to Alabama, scouting him coming out of Alabama, and then Oklahoma as well, where he really grew as a passer. But what I really appreciate about Hurts is more than his physical capabilities, his mental capabilities. Not in terms of on the field, but just like his makeup. I think he's an extremely mature quarterback for his age. He's very smart, but he's also just a great leader. He brings exactly what Philadelphia wants off the field. His work ethic is phenomenal. You see him trend forward and get better with every season of football in his life. Like, there has not been a single season in Jalen Hurts' life playing football where he has not gotten better. That's really difficult to do. It's really difficult to maintain that, right? A lot of guys can have a great year, but it's the consistency of getting better every year. And that's what we've seen with Jalen Hurts in the NFL as well. And I think that really impacts and affects the rest of his teammates. His work ethic and his consistency is what I really appreciate about Jalen Hurts. The coaching. Nick Sirianni is my number 12 head coach in the NFL. I think the only thing about him, I love his bravado. I love his, it almost seems like arrogance at times, but I really love it for his football team. I love the energy he brings to his team. I think it works in terms of his leadership. I think he's also a pretty savvy offensive coach, but I will say I want to see more. I just want to see more. For me to put him inside the top 10, I need to be blown away by a coach, because there's so many great coaches in this league and guys that have established themselves over years and tenures, and he hasn't done that quite yet, so he's just on the outside. The offensive line's the best in football, and I think has been for the last couple of years. The offense ranks at number 1 in my opinion, surpassing the Chiefs this offseason. The Eagles, I felt like maybe added a couple pieces. I think their backfield got better this offseason through free agency and trades. I feel like they have the best offensive line. They have 3 dangerous weapons in the receiving game. Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown are one of the best duos in football. And Jalen Hurts is an awesome quarterback, top 5 in my opinion. So this is the number 1 offense. And in my opinion, it is the number 1 offense because it's the most balanced. They can run the ball, they can pass the ball, they can stretch you vertically, they can beat you on quarterback sneaks continuously with the little cheat play that they have in short yardage. The roster I have at number 3, a lot of people have them at number 1. I have them just below a couple of rosters. I feel like they got a little bit worse in terms of the roster this offseason. I think they lost a couple of key pieces that we'll discuss. The secondary is at number 7. I think they're a very solid secondary. What I worry about with their secondary is the turnover at safety. Honestly, 7 might be a little high based on the players they have. But I feel like last year, Slay, Bradbury, Maddox, those guys were so good last year, it's hard to disrespect them. So I still believe they're a top 10 secondary, but I would like to see them be able to have more versatility in the secondary, play more man coverage, be able to do that at a higher rate. Their defensive line to me is number 1. I think they have the deepest and most effective defensive line in football, despite losing Javon Hargrave, which is a massive loss. And the defense ranks at number 6. I think they could definitely decline this year, and we'll talk about that. But again, a respect thing. They have a great defensive line. Their system is clear and evident on how they want to play. They want to get after you with 4 or 5, and they want to be able to play zone coverage behind it, and they'll let their defensive line win. And when it wins, they're dominant. When it doesn't, it's not as dominant. And we saw that in the Super Bowl. But let's look at the offense. Now, one thing I will say before we get to the offense, the expectations for the Eagles this year, I would say they're high. Like, I would say it's just as high, if not higher than last year. Last year, I was a huge believer in Philadelphia. I had them like as my number 1 seed in the NFC, I want to say, or number 2 seed, I think. I think I had mistakenly Tampa Bay as number 1, which was a total whiff by me. But my call on the Eagles was darn accurate. Like, I was all over the Eagles being great last year, all over their roster talent. It was clear. It was evident. This year, the expectations are higher than last year, because even last year it was more of like, okay, let's see what they are. Let's see for a lot of people. I kind of knew based on the schedule, based on the roster talent. I believed in Jalen Hurts enough to make that happen. This year, it's like, okay, you made the Super Bowl last year. It's time to win the Super Bowl. And it doesn't always work like that. We see a lot of teams that decline with, Super Bowl. They lose the Super Bowl, and then it's the Super Bowl hangover, right? And that could very well happen with the Eagles this year. It just happens for whatever reason. A team can be super talented. A team could have expectations through the roof. It just happens, right? It's very rare that a team that goes to the Super Bowl ends up winning it the year after. Like, the only teams in recent history, it feels like, are very successful post a Super Bowl loss are the Chiefs with Mahomes and the Patriots with Brady. Other than that, and I only think the Patriots with Brady, correct me if I'm wrong, are the only teams that have won after they lost the Super Bowl the year previous, in recent history at least. So it's a difficult task to do, okay? It doesn't happen very often. And a lot of times these Super Bowl teams, it's like 50-50. They don't reach their win total 50% of the time. So now, that being said, let's take a look at the depth charts and why I believe they'll be able to match that win total, why I believe they'll be as good or close to as good as last year, but I don't know if they'll quite reach the ceiling that they did last year. So let's take a look at the offense. Now, I believe this is the best offense in the NFL, and this is my biggest stamp of why I believe the Eagles will be a dominant team once again in 2023, because I think their offense is just that damn good. I think when you have Jalen Hurts with A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, the best offensive line in football, Dallas Goedert, who's a top 5, top 6 tight end in football, you're going to be dangerous. You're going to be able to pass the ball. You're going to be able to run the ball. Your quarterback can run the ball. And now you have unique chemistry, right? A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, Lane Johnson, Jason Kelce, Dickerson, Mailata, all these guys, Gainwell, were a part of that Super Bowl team. They didn't lose barely any pieces. They lost Miles Sanders. They lost Isaac Seumalo, and that's pretty much it, right? They added Zacchaeus as a third receiver option out of Atlanta, who I think is kind of a sneaky, decent addition. As a depth receiver, they added DeAndre Swift in place of Miles Sanders. That's pretty much it. So their chemistry is super high. Now, I will say the scheme will have a little bit of a turnover. I think they're going to keep things very similar as what they had under Shane Steichen. I really liked how Shane Steichen called plays last year. I felt like he had a great feel for a change-up. The one thing I appreciated about Shane Steichen, as basic at times as he kept things, right? When you have that good of an offensive line, when you're able to run the ball at the rate that they were able to run the ball, when you're clicking down the field like they were clicking, Steichen was very simple in his approach, in his scheme. Like, you didn't see a lot of like crazy stuff going on, trick plays, double reverse. You barely even saw any like jet sweeps. You barely saw any motion. I would say that the Eagles were a pretty simple but super effective offense, which is what made them so tough. Like, because it wasn't smoke and mirrors. It was just, we're smashing you in the face. We're better than you. And they maybe came up against one or two defenses all year that could even stand pat with them, that could even play with them. Like the 49ers at times, and Dallas at times, and Washington played well with them, and there was like a couple of games where they had moments where they were struggling. That was about it. Philadelphia is just that dominant in terms of especially the line of scrimmage, where they just dominated things. But Steichen was so good with the changeup. Once a defense figured out, okay, we got him. We figured him out. This is how we're going to slow him down. Bam, third quarter, all of a sudden, Shane Steichen comes out with a new run, or just a sprinkle of a new play, or a new just fundamental game plan tweak that made the Eagles go over the top and dominate that second half, or just figure something out that they could attack, that they were able to attack and take over the game. That was very evident in the NFC Championship. I thought it was brilliant. And Shane Steichen was brilliant last year. So they're going to have to match that in terms of those wrinkles. The wrinkles of the offense is what they might miss. But the overall philosophy and fundamentals will be easy to replicate, in my opinion. And the play calling, I don't think, was anything crazy special. I just think it's the consistency of the talent that they have, which is what really is impressive. Now, Juergens is also the new guy on the offensive line. He was a second-round pick. projected to be a center in the future to replace Jason Kelce, but Kelce was a big fan of him coming out of college. I believe he's going to be a good player because that's just what the Eagles do. They draft guys that are good on the offensive line, and they did that with Landon Dickerson, and I believe that's the same thing going to happen with Juergens here. Now, the running back situation's a little tricky. I'm a big Kenny Gainwell fan, and I wouldn't be surprised if he became their reliable go-to option out of the backfield. Don't get me wrong, he's not an every down back, so they're going to have to get something out of DeAndre Swift or potentially Rashad Penny or someone else. Maybe they even try to go after Jonathan Taylor or something like that, but I think Kenny Gainwell is a sneaky guy that I thought played well in almost every game that he was given the opportunity last season. Defensively, now this is where I think they're going to take a step back. Now, obviously, they lost their head coach of the Arizona Cardinals there, and Jonathan Gannon, who was their defensive coordinator. That's not the biggest reason I think they're going to decline. Like, I was never the biggest Jonathan Gannon fan. I will say his ability to maximize the defensive line is certainly something that did take place. Like, as good as the defensive line talent was, their ability to set the NFL record in sacks has something to do with the coaching. It has something to do, right? So they lose Javon Hargrave, and I think that is a loss that I don't think enough people are giving the credit it deserves. I mean, Javon Hargrave is one of the 3 to 4 best pass rushers at his position in the NFL. This is a guy that's a double-digit sack artist from the interior. That is only Chris Jones and Aaron Donald company. Like, that's very rare. Maybe Cam Hayward, right? So he goes to your biggest rival in this NFC, other than, I guess, Dallas, in San Francisco, and we'll talk about that when we get to San Francisco. But I feel like that is a big loss. And I understand you drafted Jalen Carter, who was my favorite, number 1 defensive player in the draft. But that being said, it wasn't for this year. It was for like 2, 3, 4 years from now, where I felt like Jalen Carter would be an absolute force. In year 1, to expect him to be Javon Hargrave is just too much. It's just too much. Like, it's not going to happen, okay? Jalen Carter, and that being said, I don't think Jalen Carter's ever going to be Javon Hargrave from a pass rushing perspective. Like, I don't think he's ever going to get there. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think he's just a pure force of a physical specimen, and he'll be a good player, but I don't think he'll be like a dominant player in year 1. Jordan Davis had his moments during his rookie season, but he didn't play a lot. They actually tried to bring in Linval Joseph and Ndamukong Suh to help that rotation out because I don't think they were getting enough out of Jordan Davis. So we'll see if he can up his game. Obviously, they still have Fletcher Cox. Fletcher Cox is a veteran who can still play some snaps, but he's not clearly 2017 Fletcher Cox. Like, he's going to get in there and he's going to rush the passer a little bit. I don't think he's going to be a guy that rotates in very much. Brandon Graham's kind of the same. Like, Brandon Graham's still a very good player. Like, probably better than Fletcher Cox at this point. Top 32 defensive end in my opinion still. But man, rotation player, right? So they're going to have to rely on Reddick and Sweat to get to the quarterback a lot this year, more so than last year, because they don't have that 10-sack type of guy from the interior. That being said, this is a defensive line that I said is the best in football, and there's a reason for it. They have a ton of depth. I'm bringing up Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox coming off of the bench, right? And then you've got, guys that like Nolan Smith, first-round pick coming off the bench. So Sweat, Reddick, those guys are going to go for 10 sacks probably this year as well. That being said, linebacker duo is a lot weaker than last year in my opinion. I'm not a fan of Nakobe Dean. I wasn't coming out of the draft. I think he's too small and I think he's too slow. I do think that he sees the game well and he's a smart linebacker, but I just think physical wise, like he'll be taken advantage of at this level. Nicholas Moreau has never been very good. So I do worry about these linebackers. I think TJ Edwards was such a blessing for you guys where you were able to find him and he was actually a really good linebacker for you guys. The cornerback position I think is pretty good, but also old. Like Slay and Bradbury are past, I would argue they're getting past their prime at this point. Slay was spectacular last year. Bradbury played above his head last year. Both were great. That being said, they struggle in man coverage a bit, so it makes you very predictable in your coverages, and I think if your pass rush is not quite as good as last year, and your linebacker position is a little bit of a disadvantage, and it can be taken advantage of in the middle of the field, I think teams will find it a little bit easier to pass on you this year. And then you get to the safety level, where I think that the rookie coming in, I believe it's Brown, who I was a fan of, coming out of the draft, very athletic guy. I'm not sure how much he'll play. Maybe he'll mix in by the end of the year, especially. But Blankenship's had some good reports out of training camp. I know he picked off Deshaun Watson a couple times in practice. Edmonds has been okay at best with Pittsburgh. I do worry about that position after you lost your two primary starters last year. Like, Epps played like 1,000 snaps for you last year. That's a lot. And then CJ Gardner-Johnson was like the leading interception guy in the NFL. So you're losing key starters. Edwards, your two safeties, Javon Hargrave, your defensive coordinator. I'd expect a step back from this defense. I still think they'll be above average. I think their defensive line is too good to not be. But I feel like there are certainly weaknesses that against good offenses, you'll get lit up at times this year. And I felt like last year you didn't really play a lot of good offenses. So you kind of got by and beat up on some bad offenses. So overall, I feel like Philadelphia, very talented team, still stacked. I think Howie Roseman's the best GM in football. I like the coaching overall from Nick Sirianni. We'll see what the new coordinators look like. Jalen Hurts is a great leader. He'll keep this team on task, and they've got so much talent. It's hard to underwhelm. But I have Philadelphia in the playoffs at 12-5. I think they will decline in terms of their regular season record this year, and as an overall dominant team. I think they'll be a very good team, but maybe a little bit more human this year. They also play a lot more difficult schedule. They play a first place schedule this year as opposed to a second place schedule, and last year they had one of the weakest schedules in football, which is why I believe they were only able to lose 2 games. I think it was last year. Their ceiling is 15-2. That being said, if Jalen Carter just is an absolute freak in year one and their defense plays at the level it did last year, along with the best offense in football, then yeah, they're going to be tough to beat. That being said, floor is 9-8. They have a very high floor because it's a weak conference. Jalen Hurts is a good quarterback. They've got a pretty decent backup in Marcus Mariota if Hurts misses some time. And I also like that they got a mobile quarterback behind Hurts instead of Gardner Minshew, even though I like Gardner Minshew. They have a great offensive line, a great defensive line. They have a great deep roster. It's hard to underwhelm if you're this team. I think their floor is 9-8, probably as like the 7th wild card team or something like that. Kind of like the season after you won the Super Bowl in 2017. That would be like the floor for this year. Is like you go like 9-7, 9-8. I think it was 9-7 back then, and you still made the playoffs. And I think you almost beat the Saints that one year. That would be something like your floor this season, where it's a little underwhelming, but you still figure it out near the end and you make the playoffs. I'm going to go over for the projection of 11.5, although it wouldn't be one of my favorite bets just because it's such a high number. And I do think it is likely that the Eagles lose 4 to 6 games this year, just because it's hard in this division, the best division in the NFC, better schedule, all that stuff. Regression incoming for the Eagles a little bit, but man, they're still so talented. Expect them to be very good this year. The next team in the NFC is the New York G-Men. The Giants are next up, and the Giants, I was a huge fan of going into last year. I was all over them to make the playoffs. I was all over them to be an underrated, up-and-coming team, and I felt like everyone was overlooking the coaching changes because I knew how bad Joe Judge and that staff was for Daniel Jones specifically, and I understood how brilliant Brian Daboll was as a Patriots fan, seeing him grow up in our system as a coach and then also seeing him in Buffalo torch my defenses in New England. I understood that he was a great coordinator. And then I loved Wink Martindale in Baltimore. Big fan of him as well. And that's the same thing that can be said about this year in terms of I think they're a little underrated. I think they're a little disrespected. I think they've certainly improved their talent. But there's a lot of questions about luck, right? This is a team that had the least amount of 20-yard passing plays over the past 20 years in the NFL, and they made the playoffs. Makes no sense. They had the least amount of turnovers in football last year. That really doesn't replicate no matter how hard you try, and it's the least amount of turnovers that a Giants team has had in 20 years. So this team screams regression in terms of luckiness, right? They were very lucky. They were very fortunate. They won a lot of games at the end. Now, a lot of that has to do with situational football. Trust me, I understand that. As a Patriots fan, Belichick drills that into these guys' heads in New England, and I think Daboll's the same way. Like, they're very prepared for those situations. There's a reason they're good at it. But that being said, sometimes your kicker might miss the kick at the end of the game. Or sometimes you might get a batted ball that ends up intercepted instead of caught, right? So there's things that can happen throughout the course of an NFL season, along with injuries that could take place that maybe didn't take place last year. Although your defense was a little bit beat up last year, I would expect the Giants to be pretty close to what they were last year. The question is, will they be able to overcome a more difficult schedule and some of those probable regression areas. So let's take a look at the rankings for the Giants. I think that a lot of Giants fans are looking forward to a fun season this year. I don't think you guys expect the Super Bowl. I don't think you guys expect another playoff win, but I think you guys would expect to make the playoffs again. I think you guys do expect to stay relevant this year. That's, I think, what the expectations are for the Giants. I think outside of New York, the Giants are pretty much a team that, I feel is a little disrespected. I feel like a lot of people expect them to regress outright and expect them to miss the playoffs and expect them that they were just a fluke last year. So it's kind of a weird expectation space for the Giants entering this season. But let's take a look at those rankings. So at number 12, I had Daniel Jones as the number 12 quarterback in the NFL, which I think a lot of people responded and said, whoa, Mitch, that's high. But Daniel Jones, listen to me, okay? I called him the most underrated quarterback in the NFL last year. It's what he's able to do with his legs. It's what he's able to do with his physical capabilities, and then his ability to not make mistakes. I understand he didn't make a lot of big-time throws down the field. I understand that he was helped out a lot by the scheme. But man, he had no weapons. No weapons. Other than Saquon Barkley, nobody at wide receiver. Nobody at tight end to really take advantage of matchups on the outside. So you got to give the guy respect for being a weapon as a runner. I don't think he gets enough respect for his legs. I don't think he gets enough respect for what he was able to do last year. So I ranked him very high. Would I be shocked if Daniel Jones played more like the 20th quarterback this year? No. Why? Because the weapons haven't changed that much this year. And honestly, if Darren Waller doesn't come through, I'm not sure they have a real number one threat. And I'm not sure that Brian Daboll will be able to replicate the magic from a scheme standpoint that he was able to. And I'm not sure Daniel Jones will be able to protect the ball the way he did last year, because that was phenomenal. So it's going to be hard for him to replicate his production from last year in terms of just being as solid and consistent as he was last year. That being said, I could see Daniel Jones having a better statistical season this year than he did last year. I almost count on it because I think they're going to have to get in games against better opponents and a tougher schedule where he's going to have to make plays. Okay, the coaching, Brian Daboll at 13, you could argue he's already a top 10 coach in football. I think as an overall staff, coordinators involved, this is a top 10 staff in football. Offensive line, 25th. I still need to see more. I think there's going to be progression from Evan Neal. I like that they turned over the center position with a young guy, and I thought he was the best in the draft. I also feel like Andrew Thomas is a stud, and the guards aren't bad. I like Mark Lewinsky. I think he's a fine player. Offensive rank, I have them in the top 20 at 18. This could definitely improve. I could see them being a top half offense. I think their scheme, the way they attack defenses, the way they're game plan specific, I could see pretty good balance coming from this offense between Saquon, Daniel Jones's legs, the passing game, the tight end production, the receiver production. I think there's a lot of different ways they can attack you. Roster rank, I have at 19. I think it's pretty fair. Secondary at 23. They have some question marks, but some young, promising players. Defensive line, I think, is the strength of their defense with Leonard Williams and Dexter Lawrence and company. The defense, I have at 21. They weren't a very good defense last year. I could see them being about the same, but maybe a little better this year, at least I hope. So that's the Giants rankings. And again, guys, I like the Giants. I hope they're good this year. I think the NFL is more interesting when they are good. Now let's take a look at the depth charts. In terms of the offense, the defense, let's speak about some of these new players and then also how I see it looking for the offense and the defense. So Isaiah Hodgins, currently I have slated as their number one wide receiver. People could argue with 5 different names. They could say it might be Paris Campbell. It might be Darius Slayton. It might be Jalen Hyatt. I don't know. It might be one of these other guys. But Isaiah Hodgins was their number one guy last year. I give him that respect. I think he played really well last year. And I think he is Daniel Jones' favorite target. He'll be utilized all over the formation. Paris Campbell was really good in the slot with the Colts. I really liked him as a pickup. I think he has a lot of upside still left in those bones. I think second round pick a few years back of the Colts. He's a very fast guy. I think if you get him in space and get him, I think he could really work with Daboll because he can get Campbell separation. And then if you get him with yards after catch, he can make some real damage. Then Darius Slayton, I've always liked him as a depth wide receiver. I think he's a good contributor getting vertical down the field. Darren Waller is one that I like the trade for the Giants. I felt like they needed a game-changing piece, but I will say I'm a little bit more negative in terms of Darren Waller's addition than other people, just because like everyone's raving about him right now, and that's just the way it is every year with Darren Waller. Like the guy's a freak. He's always going to stand out in training camp. He's always going to stand out, but he gets hurt a lot. He's very unreliable. So just expect Darren Waller to have games this year where he's Superman and other games where he's not available. And you're going to be frustrated, but it's just going to happen. If you get prime Darren Waller, now we're talking about something special. But I don't know. He hasn't been that for a couple of years, in my opinion. The offensive line, again, I expect Evan Neal to improve. Schmitz is interesting, and I like the rest of the line pretty much. Then the only thing about the running back position, I would say, Saquon I love. He's one of my favorite players in the NFL. They don't have much depth. Matt Breida is getting a little bit older. I would have liked them to have added like a decent backup, but I don't know. It is what it is. And Tyrod Taylor's also the backup quarterback. He's serviceable. So the offense is pretty good, honestly. I do like the offense just because they're kind of unique in terms of they've got a lot of depth. Who's going to stand out? Who's going to break out? Is it going to be Hyatt? Is it going to be Campbell? Is Waller going to come to the table? What is it going to be? Now, I think ultimately the side of the ball that needs to make a big difference this year for the Giants to be back to the playoffs, I think is the defense. I feel like if the Giants are going to make it back, the offense was very good in terms of scheme, and they were able to produce when they needed to last year, and I think that was fine. But the defense is going to need to take a step forward in terms of consistency and game-changing ability from last year under Wink Martindale. Let's check this defense out. And I think they have the capacity to do so. It kind of depends on, okay, how does Deonte Banks look as a rookie? I was a big fan of him. I was a fan of this corner class, and I felt like Banks was a top 10 player in this class overall. Like I was a big fan of his speed, big fan of his press man ability. I do think he's a little bit more raw than, a couple of the other prospects were, but we'll see, man. The guy can run, and I think he fits Martindale's system really well. His ability to run with receivers, his ability to press, it's up there. I think Thibodeau was a bit overrated coming out, but he did impress me in moments last year. He needs to really break out for this defense to really get better. Love the interior duo. Dexter Lawrence is top 4 at his position. Leonard Williams has been a beast for a long time. Adoree Jackson, according to our lads, going to play more the nickel position this year. You guys let me know what you think of that. Ojulari comes back. He'll be healthy. Okereke or Okereke or the guy I can't pronounce is a very good linebacker. I think that's the biggest improvement you guys made all offseason is the speed at linebacker that Bobby will bring going sideline to sideline. I also like the Isaiah Simmons pickup. I don't think that's a bad pickup whatsoever. He could maybe start at linebacker as well. I'm not too familiar with Beavers. I will say that. So the Giants, man, the G-Men, I think they can make the playoffs. And I've contemplated, okay, are they going to make the playoffs? Are they going to just miss the playoffs? And really what it came down to was the schedule for me. Like the schedule is so difficult for the Giants. And that's really what hurt their chances for me to confirm their spot in my predictions. So looking at their record, I have them at 8-9, which I understand is disappointing for a lot of Giants fans because they had 9 wins last year, I think. But just understand this. I think you guys are good or maybe even better than last year. I think you're just as good, if not better than last year. But I think the division is tougher. I think the schedule is way tougher. Last year, you guys had a cupcake schedule, let's be honest. And I think that regression is due in terms of luck and injury luck. So I think the Giants are going to go 8-9, maybe 9-8, maybe 7-10, but somewhere in that range. I think their ceiling is 10-7. Their floor is 6-11. And I have the over, though, in terms of the prediction. So I lean closer towards 9-8 than I do 7-10, if that makes sense. So it was really tough for me to leave the Giants out of the playoffs. I have them as my number 8 seed in the NFC. So they were the final team I had to leave out. And it was tough for me, especially because of how much I respect the coaching staff. So I could be talked into the Giants making it. You guys let me know what you think. We're going to move on to the next team in the NFC East, which is the Washington Commanders. The Washington Commanders is another team that I really actually kind of like this year. But again, toughest division in the NFC. Tough schedule. Really tough schedule. Like Washington is one of those teams that I wanted to give a better record than I did. I'm going to be honest with you. And we're going to get to it eventually. And we're going to talk through it. But it's a team that it was hard to find wins on the schedule with how many good teams they play. Washington's expectations, I feel like from a public and outside of Washington standpoint, is very low. Like lower than what I expected them. I expect them to be a competent, competitive team that has a chance for the playoffs. I think a lot of people view them as a bad team. Like downright not good. Like gonna miss the playoffs without a doubt. 4 or 5 wins. I think that's what most people think of Washington. It's a transition year for them. They're no good, blah, blah, blah. I disagree. I think Washington has real talent. I think their defense was really good last year, and I think it will be really good again. I think their offense has a lot more promise and a lot more skill than people want to give them credit for. And I think they're a lot more intriguing this year than they've been the last couple of years due to Eric Bieniemy coming to town, due to Sam Howell being the new quarterback. So, Washington. Expectations, very low. Will they surprise? Let's take a look at their rankings entering the season. So, at quarterback, number 31, I had Sam Howell. That's only because he's barely played. I mean, gonna be honest, I'm a fan of Sam Howell. And honestly, if I did the quarterback rankings now, he'd probably be like 26 or 27. Because I actually ended up studying him and making the video about Sam Howell after I did my rankings for the quarterback position. So that's incorrect. I'd probably have him closer to 27-ish. But the thing is, like, we've barely seen him play in the NFL regular season. So how high am I really going to put him? A lot of those guys at the end of the list are like rookies or guys that have barely played. So coach of the coaching rank, Ron Rivera, not a big fan of Ron Rivera right now, honestly. I felt like his prime was in Carolina, and he's kind of dwindled a little bit. But I will say this about him. His teams are always competitive, and they're always tough, and they're always in it. I will say that. He's not a special coach. I don't even think he's like an average coach. But there's something about him that he brings like a consistent toughness to his teams. Offensive line rank, definitely shaky. We'll talk about that. But Washington has been more of a sum of its parts offensive line than an individual offensive line. Like you look at the individuals over the last few years and you're like, they're not that good. But then all of a sudden they're like the 16th best offensive line. They're like the 18th best offensive line. And you would expect them to be closer to 30. This year, I actually think they do have issues. Offense rank 27, mostly because don't know much about Sam Howell. The offensive line is suspect. The running game is suspect. We'll get into more of that. Roster rank 25th. Secondary rank 22nd. A lot of young players, a lot of unknown. Defensive line, really, really good, although lacking a bit of depth. And the defense rank, number 8. I think they are a top 10 defense. They were last year. I think they will be again this year. And that's what makes them real tough. They have a formula. We've seen it. So, the offense. McLaurin, Dotson, Samuel. I think low-key one of the best trios in the NFL at wide receiver. This is the strength of the offense. Terry McLaurin, as long as he's healthy and doesn't have a banged-up toe, is going to be electric. We know that. He is an awesome football player. Maybe the most underrated number 1 receiver in the NFL. Jahan Dotson, a lot of people love him to have a breakout season. I think he will have a breakout season. I think McLaurin and Dotson will be close to 1,000 yards this year. I think McLaurin's a lock, like 1,100 yards. I think Dotson's going to have 900 to 1,000 yards this year as well. Curtis Samuel could have another 700. I think so much of this passing game is going to go through those 3 guys. The tight end position is less relevant. You still got Logan Thomas there. Running back, you're going to see a lot of Robinson and Gibson. Some people are a lot higher on Gibson in the Bieniemy offense due to his pass catching skill set. We'll see how that looks. Robinson, a good grinder in between the tackles. Sam Howell, again, talked about it. I think he's an athletic guy. I like his savviness. I like his pocket presence. I think he has a better arm than people give him credit for. I think he's very poised. I've appreciated the young guy so far. The offensive line, okay, definitely question marks. They signed Wiley out of Kansas City, but he's never really been very good. Like, I wouldn't even say he's been above average. For some reason, they decided to sign him to a long-term contract. Now, we know he can start on the offensive line for the team that won the Super Bowl. That's a positive. But how much of that is Mahomes and Andy Reid making him better than he is? Cosme's a young player moving to the guard position. We'll see how that works out. Nick Gates, appreciate his story, love his toughness. He's an okay player. Charles, suspect. Leno Jr., he's all right. They have decent depth, but nobody really above average on the offensive line, which is puzzling and very concerning for a young quarterback. And a run game that probably isn't going to be very good, but Eric Bieniemy hopefully can make the most of this team. And I think that's the X factor for Washington is Eric Bieniemy. How much can he get out of Sam Howell? How much can he get out of these weapons, especially Jahan Dotson and Terry McLaurin? And can he elevate the offense like Brian Daboll did for the Giants last year? If that takes place, they can make the playoffs because their defense is going to be good. Let's take a look at that defense. So they added Barton out of Seattle for Holcomb, who went to Pittsburgh. Sweat, Young, back as the edge rushers. Young, finally healthy, hopefully, this year. Chase Young, I think, has had a little bit of an overrated NFL career. Hasn't lived up to the hype yet, but man, the guy is an excellent athlete. Hopefully he stays on the field. Jonathan Allen is one of my favorite defensive linemen in football. Beast. Deron Payne had an awesome year last year. He's a force. Fuller's pretty consistent. Forbes is a ball hawk out of the first round. Cameron Curl is a super steady and underrated safety. Forrest, I would also say kind of underrated, like that tandem at safety. St. Juice now expected to move into the nickel position after playing more on the outside last year. So they did improve their corner position. I think they improved their safety position. Martin, I believe, is the second round pick that could also play nickel. He could also play safety. He's a hybrid player. Love their additions in the secondary. Think that will make them better. And if Chase Young stays healthy and that entire defensive line stays healthy, they're hard to run against. They're hard to block. So that makes them a good defense. I think that's pretty obvious. So Washington's a team that I could see all over the map. I could see them being not a very good team. I could see them being a surprise team. And that's where I'm kind of landing in the middle somewhere. And that's unfortunate. And it a lot has to do with the schedule. I was trying to go through doing the record predictor and being okay, where can I give them a win reasonably? So this is my record for Washington. I have them going 7-10, which I think is better than a lot of people. And I have a ceiling of 10-7. I could see them finishing 8-9 or 9-8 and flirting with the playoffs as well. I could see them being better than the Giants. I will also say that. Their floor is 4-13, where Sam Howell just sucks. We don't know if he's good or not yet. The offensive line could be lousy. Bieniemy could maybe not work out. The run game could be not very good. And the defense, maybe Chase Young gets hurt again. There's a lot of things that could happen. So the record, I have it 7-10. I think they'll be more competitive than people give them credit for. I think their defense is very good and will give a lot of teams fits. And I think their offense is going to be creative, fun to watch. I think Howell is going to be a promising young player that Washington fans can get behind for the future, but they won't be a great team this year. I think they're building towards something in the future. Okay, so that's Washington. The final team in the NFC East breakdown is, of course, the Dallas Cowboys. So the Dallas Cowboys are the final team in the NFC East. And I've been saying all offseason, really from the jump, is Dallas is the best team that nobody wants to talk about in the elite category. Nobody is talking about Dallas when it comes to winning the Super Bowl. Nobody's talking about Dallas in terms of winning the NFC. Nobody is actually given the credit to Dallas that they deserve. They've won 12 games the last 2 seasons in a row, which again, I'll say it again, they have the second most wins over the past 2 seasons, only behind Kansas City. Yeah, they've struggled in the playoffs to beat San Francisco, but they did beat Tom Brady and the Bucs last year. And I do feel this year is a breakout year for Dallas. I think their roster is absolutely ridiculously loaded. I think they have an argument for the best defense in the NFL. I think Dak Prescott has a really good weapon core around him, and when he does, he's successful. And they have, again, I think a good enough coaching staff. Dan Quinn's an awesome coordinator. Mike McCarthy has come in and stabilized this franchise, and I feel like he doesn't get any credit for that. I will say, Dallas always has high expectations. Always. They're the Dallas Cowboys. But this year, it feels like those are warranted. It's warranted. Usually, I come on this channel and I say Dallas is overrated, or I say Dallas is a decent team or a good team that isn't going to match expectations. I've usually been right about Dallas. over this channel's history, if you guys go back and look, I'm usually right. I think last year was one of the lone times I was a little down on Dallas, but yet they still were able to come through and be better than I thought last year. And that was more so because I was being talked out of them. I was so high on the Eagles, and I wasn't able to be also high. And I was also high on the Giants, which I got right. And I just forgot about Dallas for some reason. But usually I've been pretty accurate when it comes to Dallas. And I have a feeling about Dallas this year that they're going to give a lot of teams issues, and they're going to be really tough to stop this year. So let's talk about where they rank across the board. Obviously, we know expectations through the roof. They're expected to win 1, 2, 3 playoff games, as always. So let's take a look at the rankings. So at quarterback, number 10, Dak Prescott. I think over the past 6 or 7 years, he's been a top 10 to 12 quarterback in the NFL, sometimes a little bit higher, like the 8th best quarterback, sometimes a little bit lower, like the 13th best quarterback. Last year, he didn't play at a top 10 level. There's no denying that. Too many interceptions, too many turnovers, too inconsistent. But this year, I think he will. I think he will play like a top 12, top 10 quarterback. I think typically, as we've seen, Dak Prescott performs as the supporting cast performs. And I think we've heard rumors about Dak Prescott having more power at the line of scrimmage. One of his biggest assets is his brain, his ability to read defenses. I think he's a smart guy, and he's a really accurate, good timing quarterback. And when everything's on time for him, he can rip defenses apart. So Dak could have a good year this year, entering the season healthy, as long as he can stay healthy and stay consistent. Remember, he had that thumb injury last year. I broke my thumb twice. It's not an easy injury to come back from. Coaching rank, 17. Mike McCarthy's a pretty average coach. But what I will say about Mike McCarthy is he's been there. He's done that. He's won a championship. He's taken a team to the Super Bowl. He is a pro, and he has stabilized this franchise. He has brought consistency to the coaching position, which wasn't there previously. Offensive line rank, number 9. They are probably a top 10, top 12 offensive line. I have them at number 9. I feel like at their best, when they're healthy, they're a top 10 unit, but they are one with less depth than I would like. That's one of my biggest concerns about a team that I think is stacked. At number 12, their offense, I think they could be a top 10 offense this year. Last year, they kind of were in and out with that. They were at times. They had games where they were really explosive and dominant, but there were other games where they really struggled. So can they stay consistent? Tony Pollard's going to take more of the carries this year. Zeke out of the picture, okay? CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, Michael Gallup, new tight end, good offensive line as we mentioned, Dak Prescott, new play caller. I think they have enough to be a top 10 offense, but luckily for them, they don't need to be. They don't need to be, which I think is the place they need to be at to be a really good team. Dallas, I think, has maybe the best defense in football. I have them number 2 behind San Francisco. They have the best secondary in the NFL, and if you were to argue they're the best defense, I wouldn't disagree because I think they have the best balance of secondary talent and pass rush. Now, where you maybe worry a little bit is linebacker. We'll get to that. But their roster is loaded. They're a top 2 to 3 roster in the NFL. I have them above the Eagles in that regard. They just have less holes than the Eagles do. The Eagles have more holes, maybe more strengths, but more holes. The defensive line is top 3 in football, led by the freak himself, Micah Parsons. So this team is ridiculous. They're awesome. Let's talk about each unit. First, starting with the offense. So offensively, you've got CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, Michael Gallup. Big fan of the Brandon Cooks acquisition. I actually thought and predicted that Brandon Cooks would go to Dallas. I made a video predicting every free agency move. He was one that I predicted to happen, was Cooks to the Cowboys. It made too much sense. First of all, he was playing in Houston, and Houston is in Texas. So it wasn't a far move for Brandon Cooks, a guy that's played in New Orleans and LA and New England. He's moved everywhere. So it's not too crazy, right? But also, I will say that Brandon Cooks is the element that Dallas's offense needed. They needed a deep threat. They needed a guy with speed. And Brandon Cooks is a little bit older now, but the guy can still run. He has 4.3 speed. And I remember, when he was in New England, Belichick has he would rave. He doesn't rave about everybody, but he would rave about Brandon Cooks' stamina and his cardio, and ridiculous cardio. So this guy can run for days. He's in great shape. He rarely gets injured, and he's going to be such a reliable number 2. And I think that's what he is at this point in his career. He's probably not a number 1. He's never really been a pure alpha number 1. He's always kind of been a fringe number 1. He's always been better as a number 2. But he's just super consistent, man. 1,000 yards after 1,000 yards, even at his older age, brings great speed, really refined and detailed routes, really effective on the outside the numbers. And I think that's what Dallas has been missing. Outside the numbers playmaking and deep threat ability. And that's what Brandon Cooks brings, right? CeeDee Lamb is more of a playmaker in between the numbers. He's more of an inside the defense type of guy. Cooks can operate on comebacks, out routes, and really get open for Dak and stress defenses at every level and horizontally and vertically. So I'm excited for how Cooks and Lamb can benefit off of each other with how they actually, their skill sets very much mesh. Michael Gallup is another guy that can play on the outside and get down the field. Now, I think Brandon Cooks was brought in because they didn't have as much faith in Michael Gallup to be that guy to separate at the level that he used to. But I will say, he's healthier this year, right? He's ready to go this year. He's in much better shape this year than he has been previously. So he might benefit from being a number 3 instead of a number 2 at this stage in his career, and that might pay dividends for the offense overall. Ferguson, a more athletic Schultz. I think this guy can break out this year. He can block, he can catch. We've seen promising moments of him. I'm not sure he'll be Dalton Schultz right away, but I think he has some upside. They also have good depth behind him. It's going to be an interesting fit there to see how he replaces Schultz and how they divide those targets that Dalton Schultz got. I almost felt like Dalton Schultz, as good and reliable as he was almost like a deterrent for Dak to be at his best, because he was such an easy dump off and such an easy check down that oftentimes Dak would look away from making the big throw down the field. Running back, Pollard, Davis, Vaughn. The question with the running back position is not Tony Pollard, who I think is going to have an amazing year this year, and I would draft him in fantasy. The question is the backups. Will Vaughn play? Will Davis play? Who's the next guy up after Pollard? And to spell Pollard. They brought in Trey Lance as QB3, which is interesting. They still have a pretty good backup behind Prescott, who won a lot of games last year as well, so I wouldn't worry about that. The offensive line, you've got Zach Martin, who's arguably the best right guard in football. Terrence Steele played really well in his opportunity last year. Tyron Smith didn't have his best season last year. Hopefully he bounce back and he can just stay healthy. They have 1 or 2 proven backups behind to replace Tyron Smith. But what I would expect is that Tyler Smith, so let's say Tyron Smith misses a couple games this year, which is likely because he usually does. I think Tyler Smith would move to left tackle, and I think they would slot in an interior player from there. Biadasz is still the center as far as I know, but he's in a little bit of a competition. But overall, the offensive line is pretty good. The offense is good, balanced. They'll run the ball. They'll pass the ball. I really like the way the offense looks, especially when you consider that it's a balanced offense. And this is what I love. And this comes from, again, everything I know is from Patriots, right? This is what I know. Balanced offense with a good defense wins a lot of games. That's what I know. Okay, that's what I know. So looking at the defense, this defense is one of my favorite, probably my favorite in the NFL. I love Gilmore. I'm such a big Gilmore fan, and I loved the addition of him. I think he's one of the smartest football players I've ever seen. Just his intelligence is off the charts. The way that he studies offenses, he studies receivers, he studies routes. He is going to elevate everybody on this defense. He was very good last year. I don't think anyone talks about how good he was in Indianapolis last year. He made play after play in key moment after key moment. He made the biggest plays in the Denver game, in the Chiefs game. There was like 3 or 4 games that he won for the Indianapolis Colts last year. He'll do the very same this year. And there's less pressure on him to do that because you got a guy like Diggs on the other side who can lock down a guy just as well as Stephon Gilmore. I also love how both of these guys can play man and zone at a very high level, and they will play a lot of cover one. Jordan Lewis is back at the nickel position, very capable player in the nickel position. But you also got Deron Bland, who can play safety or corner. Love the depth at the corner position. And again, going back to Gilmore, he's going to make Diggs a better player. Absolutely. He's going to make Lewis, Wilson, Hooker, all these guys a better player. How he studies the game, how he helps everybody. That's the reason J.C. Jackson was able to get to the level he did. It's because Gilmore was beside him, helping him, tutoring him. And I think that's going to pay dividends for this team. The leadership, the experience, the proven championships. Gilmore is that dude. Okay, linebacker position, it's probably the weakest on the defense, but Van Der Esch played really well last year. If he stays healthy, he's a good linebacker. He's a good linebacker. And Clark, pretty solid as well. I believe they lost one of their linebackers to injury. I think it was the rookie out of Texas. But they always seem to find some decent linebacker depth. Cox is also there as well. The defensive line, Lawrence and Parsons on the edge, dominant edge duo. Lawrence, the do-it-all guy. Parsons, the sack animal. He could win Defensive Player of the Year this year. Odigizua was very close to making my top 32 interior defensive lineman. Very underrated player. And Mozzie Smith is a very solid rookie addition. I felt like their biggest, and this is the biggest thing about Dallas for me that I think people overlook. Dallas was a 12-win football team last year. 12 wins. They won a playoff game. Their three biggest holes on their football team last year. Defensive line. They added a first-round pick. Wide receiver. They added Brandon Cooks, a 4 or 5-time 1,000-yard receiver. Corner, 2. Stephon Gilmore, a Hall of Famer, and a former Defensive Player of the Year. So their three biggest holes they added. And not only did they add, they made them strengths. They made wide receiver a strength. They made corner a strength. They made defensive line a heck of a lot better than it's been in the last couple of years. And they have great depth on defense, especially the defensive line. So my record for the Dallas Cowboys is 13-4. And the champions of the NFC East. The NFC East champion has not repeated in a very long time. And I don't think it will start this year. The Cowboys, I think, are a better overall football team than the Philadelphia Eagles. I think the Eagles have the better offense. I think the Cowboys have the better defense. I think the schedule will be tougher on the Eagles this year. Last year it was the Cowboys. I think the Cowboys edged them out. I think they just beat them out. Remember, the Cowboys almost won the division last year without Dak Prescott being there for like 5 or 6 games. That's crazy, right? They won 12 games without their quarterback playing for like 5 games. Then their ceiling, 15-2. I think they could be a dominant team. Their floor is 8-9 just because they're the Cowboys. Drama, injuries could take place. Some of their additions, let's say Cooks and Gilmore, right? Maybe they get old, right? Maybe they get old. That could happen. The same reason I said for Philadelphia, right? Slay could get old. Those guys could get old. Same with Gilmore, right? It can happen. And in terms of their win projection, 10.5, I would take the over, absolutely. I think in some places it might still be 9.5. If that's true, I would totally take the over. But 10.5, I'd still take the over on the Dallas Cowboys. I think they're the best team that nobody talks about. Like, they are an elite team that nobody wants to give that respect. So my NFC East standings, guys, 13-4 for the Dallas Cowboys, first place. The Philadelphia Eagles, 12-5. The New York Giants, 8-9 in third place, just missing the playoffs. The Eagles will have the top wild card seed in the NFC. The Washington Commanders, 7-10. So basically, the Cowboys I have as the number 2 seed in the NFC. So I believe that they will almost swap with the Eagles from last year. The Eagles will swap with the Cowboys, playing the weakest team of the division winners, which I think will come from the NFC South, and they should be able to win that matchup. The New York Giants, 8-9, and then the Commanders 7-10. The best division in the NFC, in my opinion, for 2023. Let me know, guys, what you think. Let me know your predictions, your projections, and your thoughts about the NFC East. If you guys are enjoying this series, don't forget to subscribe, man. Don't forget to Gronk spike that like button. Support this channel. Support me if you like. Become a YouTube member. Become a patron. And support my journey as a creator. I can't do it without you guys. I honestly can't. So please show me that love and support if you like. We'll see you soon. Peace.